You can feel it before you can explain it. A hand reaches for the phone, then stops. A message is already open, then closed again. The room is quiet, but your body is not. Your chest is still listening. Your mind is still making excuses. And somewhere underneath all of that, there is a question you keep trying not to ask too directly. Is this love? Or is this hunger wearing love's face? That question can haunt a woman for months, sometimes years. Because emotional hunger is very good at dressing itself up. It borrows tenderness, it borrows loyalty, it borrows memory, it even borrows sacrifice. And if you are not careful, it will convince you that the ache in your body is proof of depth. But ache is not always depth. Sometimes ache is simply a wound that has learned how to speak in the language of romance. There is a difference between loving someone and needing them to soothe an old emptiness. There is a difference between being moved by another human being and being pulled by a private starvation that has attached itself to that human being. On the outside, those two things can look almost identical. On the inside, they feel very different. Love has room in it. Emotional hunger tightens. Love can wait without panicking. Emotional hunger watches the clock, the screen, the tone, the pause, the delay, the half-hearted reply, the tiny shift in energy like it is a matter of survival. And if you have ever found yourself rereading one sentence over and over, not because it was beautiful, but because it was all you had, then you already know how easily the mind can mistake scarcity for meaning. The deeper truth is that many people do not fall in love with a person first. They fall into a feeling. They fall into relief. They fall into the fantasy of finally being chosen, finally being seen, finally being enough in someone else's eyes. That is where the confusion begins. Because when another person touches your unhealed places, your nervous system can call it destiny. Carl Jung understood something important here, even if people often reduce his work to slogans. He knew that we do not only see people as they are, we also see them through the hidden contents of our own psyche. We project, we imagine, we fill in the blank spaces with old longings, old fears, old unfinished stories. And when that happens, the person in front of us can become larger than life, not because they truly are, but because they have been given a role in our inner world. That role can feel intoxicating. He seems to understand you without trying. She seems unlike anyone you've met. The connection feels charged, alive, almost fated. But sometimes what feels fated is simply the unconscious recognizing an old pattern and rushing toward it with open arms. That is not a moral failure. It is human. Still, it matters. Because if you do not know the difference between love and hunger, you will keep offering your heart to whatever briefly feeds your emptiness. And what feeds emptiness is not always what feeds the soul. Love does not ask you to disappear. Hunger does. Love does not require you to abandon your own center just to keep the bond alive. Hunger does. Love can tolerate truth. Hunger is terrified of truth, because truth might reveal that the bond was built more on need than on mutual seeing. And that is why so many people stay confused for so long. They are not only attached to the person, they are attached to the feeling that the person gave them, the feeling of being needed, the feeling of being chosen, the feeling of being special, the feeling of being rescued from loneliness for a few brief moments. When that feeling becomes the main source of emotional oxygen, the relationship stops being a meeting between two selves and becomes a supply line. One person gives, the other person consumes. Sometimes both people do it in different ways. Sometimes one person is starving and the other is withholding. Sometimes both are starving, and neither one knows how to ask for real closeness without turning it into pressure. This is where the pain gets more specific. You may tell yourself you miss him, but what exactly do you miss? Do you miss the actual man, with all his limits, his habits, his contradictions, his ordinary human edges? Or do you miss the version of yourself that came alive when he paid attention? Do you miss her voice, his laugh, the late-night conversations, the shared jokes? Yes, maybe. But underneath that, do you miss the relief of not feeling invisible? Do you miss the hope that someone finally saw the parts of you that you usually hide? Do you miss the fantasy that this time, unlike the others, the ache would resolve into safety? That is a very different question. And it changes everything, because emotional hunger is not just about wanting love. It is about wanting love to repair something that love alone cannot repair. It is about wanting another person to fill a gap that was shaped much earlier, often before you had words for it. A child who had to earn attention. A girl who learned that being easy made her safer. A woman who discovered that her softness was welcomed only when it was useful to someone else. These experiences do not disappear just because you become an adult. They go underground. They become a complex. A complex is not just a feeling. It is a knot of memory, emotion, expectation, and old pain that gets activated by certain situations. When the complex is touched, your response can become much bigger than the present moment. You are not only reacting to what is happening now, you are also reacting to everything it resembles. That is why one unread message can feel like rejection from an entire lifetime. That is why one cold tone can feel like being placed outside the warmth of the world. That is why one moment of attention can feel like proof that you were never really asking for too much. This is the part most people do not want to admit. Emotional hunger can make you romanticize inconsistency, because inconsistency keeps the fantasy alive. If someone is fully unavailable, the mind eventually has to face reality. But if they are just available enough, just warm enough, just confusing enough, your psyche can keep hoping. Hope becomes a drug, uncertainty becomes a habit, and the nervous system begins to call the cycle chemistry. But chemistry is not the same as love. Sometimes chemistry is just the body recognizing a familiar wound. Sometimes the person who feels most magnetic is the one who most clearly fits an old emotional template, not because they are right for you, but because your unconscious knows how to move around them. You know how to chase, you know how to wait, you know how to overthink, you know how to interpret crumbs as a feast. You know how to make someone's minimal effort feel like a miracle because your inner world has been trained to survive on less. That is not love, that is adaptation. And adaptation can be so convincing that it wears the face of devotion. There is a moment, usually quiet, when a woman begins to sense that she is not actually in love with the person as much as she is in love with the possibility of being healed through him. She may not say it that way. She may say, "I just know there is something here," or "I can't let go," or "No one has ever made me feel like this." But what she may really mean is, "No one has ever touched this wound so precisely." That is why the bond feels sacred, not because it is necessarily sacred in itself, but because it has reached a sacred wound. And sacred wounds are dangerous when they are not understood, because they can make you confuse intensity for intimacy. Intimacy is not the same as intensity. Intensity can come from fear. Intensity can come from uncertainty. Intensity can come from the ego's need to win, the shadow's need to prove something, the abandoned part's need to finally be chosen. Intimacy, on the other hand, asks for presence. It asks for consistency. It asks for reality. It asks for two people who can remain themselves without turning the connection into a battlefield of longing and withdrawal. That is often where the ego gets involved. The ego wants certainty. The ego wants a story. The ego wants to know whether this means something, whether they care, whether they will come back, whether the silence is temporary, whether the delay is a test, whether the pain is a sign. The ego hates ambiguity, so it reaches for meaning too quickly, and in that rush, it can turn longing into prophecy. But the unconscious does not speak only in the language of the ego. It speaks in symbols, in dreams, in patterns, in the strange repetition of the same emotional scene with different faces. You meet one unavailable person after another. You keep choosing the same kind of almost love. You keep feeling more alive in the chase than in the calm. You keep being drawn to what withholds. You keep calling it fate. That repetition is not random. It is the psyche trying to make you see something, not to punish you, to reveal you. The question is not only, why do they not love me properly? The deeper question is, why does my system recognize this pattern as home? That question can be uncomfortable because it removes the comfort of pure innocence, but it also gives you power. If you are only a victim of the pattern, you are helpless. If you can see your part in the pattern, you can begin to change it. And your part does not mean you caused the other person's behavior. Your part means you may have been trained to confuse emotional starvation with connection. You may have learned to feel loved when you were being pursued, needed, or temporarily chosen. You may have learned that love is something you earn by being useful, beautiful, patient, understanding, forgiving, low maintenance, or endlessly available. So when someone finally makes you feel wanted, your whole system wakes up. And if the feeling is strong enough, you may ignore the fact that they are not actually meeting you. They are only stimulating the part of you that is desperate to be met. This is where the persona enters the picture. The persona is the face we learn to wear in order to belong. It is the version of ourselves we present to the world. For some women, the persona becomes the one who understands, the one who never asks for too much, the one who is easy to love, the one who is calm, the one who gives without complaint. That persona can be admired, it can even be rewarded. But if it is built on self-abandonment, it becomes a beautiful cage. Because the more you perform being easy to love, the less room there is to reveal the parts of you that are actually hungry, angry, lonely, or afraid. And those parts do not disappear. They wait. They wait until a person appears who seems able to touch them. Then the persona cracks. And suddenly, you are not just dealing with a relationship. You are dealing with the collapse of a role you have been living inside for years. That is why some women feel ashamed of how attached they became. They think, I should have known better. But shame is often the wrong conclusion. The real issue is that the relationship activated a wound that the persona had been covering. The hunger was already there. The person did not create it. They revealed it. This is a difficult distinction, but it is a freeing one. Because if the hunger is older than the relationship, then the relationship is not the only place where healing must happen. And if the relationship is not the only place where healing must happen, then you stop handing another person the job of saving you from your own emptiness. That is where love begins to separate itself from hunger. Love can say, I want you, and I still belong to myself. Hunger says, I need you, and without you, I feel like I disappear. Love can notice disappointment without collapsing. Hunger turns disappointment into a crisis. Love can let someone be human. Hunger needs them to be the answer. There is another layer here, and this one matters deeply. Emotional hunger often makes people overvalue potential and undervalue reality. You fall in love with who they could be if they healed, if they grew, if they finally opened up, if they finally understood, if they finally became tender, consistent, available. You may even be genuinely compassionate, but compassion becomes self-betrayal when it keeps you attached to a future that is not being built. Reality is quieter than fantasy. Reality is in what they do repeatedly, not in what they hint at once. Reality is in the pattern, not the promise. Reality is in the way your body feels after the interaction. Do you feel calmer, clearer, steadier? Or do you feel spun, anxious, preoccupied, desperate to decode? The body knows. It knows before the mind wants to admit it. A love that is healthy may stir you, but it does not leave you starving for the next small hit. A hunger bond can leave you checking your phone like a ritual, rereading old texts like scripture, and interpreting silence like an oracle. That is not because you are weak. It is because the nervous system can become attached to intermittent reinforcement. A little attention, then withdrawal. A little warmth, then distance. A little hope, then confusion. The unpredictability itself becomes addictive. And once again, Jung helps us understand why this can happen so powerfully. The psyche does not only seek pleasure, it seeks completion. It seeks the missing piece. It seeks the lost image of wholeness. So when someone appears who seems to carry that missing piece, the unconscious may attach to them with extraordinary force. But what you are seeking is not only them. You are seeking the feeling of being restored. The danger is that a human being cannot carry the weight of your restoration without eventually failing you. No one can be your entire cure. No one can be the permanent answer to an ancient ache. That is too much to place on love. It is too much to place on another person. And it is too much to place on yourself when you keep trying to force the bond into something it is not. If this is touching something in you, stay with it. Because the point is not to make you cynical. The point is to make you clear. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself when this video ends. Not for anyone else, just for you. A sentence that tells the truth about what you have been confusing with love. Sometimes the sentence is simple. I was not only missing him, I was missing the feeling of being chosen. Or, I thought I wanted him, but I was really chasing relief. Or, I kept calling it love because hunger sounded too painful. That kind of honesty can feel brutal at first, but it is also the beginning of freedom. Because once you can name hunger, you can stop feeding it with fantasy. And once you stop feeding it with fantasy, you begin to feel the difference between longing and love in your body. Longing is frantic. Love is steady. Longing is possessive. Love is spacious. Longing wants to merge. Love respects distance. Longing says, "Don't leave me." Love says, "Be real with me." Longing is often about the self trying to repair itself through another person. Love is the self meeting another person from a more grounded place. This is why the shadow matters too. The shadow is the part of us we do not want to admit. In this context, the shadow may contain envy, neediness, fear, resentment, dependency, fantasy, and the secret wish to be rescued. Many women are taught to be graceful about everything, even their pain, so they do not let themselves fully feel the uglier, more honest truth. I wanted this person to save me from my loneliness. Or, I wanted them to make me feel chosen enough to quiet the ache. Or, I wanted them to prove I was not too much, not too little, not too late. When that truth is rejected, it does not vanish. It goes into the shadow, and the shadow often returns as obsession. What you refuse to feel directly, you will feel indirectly through fixation. That is why emotional hunger can become so consuming. It is not only desire, it is disowned need. It is a rejected part of the self demanding attention through the only language it was allowed to use. The good news is that once you stop shaming the need, you can finally care for it, not by handing it to the wrong person, by turning toward yourself with more honesty than you have ever allowed before. Maybe you have been starving for tenderness. Maybe you have been starving for consistency. Maybe you have been starving for the experience of being held without having to perform. Maybe you have been starving for the right to need without feeling weak. There is nothing shameful about those needs. The shame comes when you make another person responsible for satisfying them in a way that erases your own center. Love does not ask you to erase yourself. Emotional hunger often does, and it can be subtle. It can show up as over-explaining, over-giving, over-apologizing, overthinking, over-attaching to every sign. It can show up as staying too long because leaving feels like admitting the hunger was real. It can show up as taking crumbs and calling it patience. It can show up as mistaking anxiety for intuition because anxiety is loud and intuition is quiet. That is one of the hardest lessons. Real intuition does not usually scream. It does not beg. It does not spin in circles. It often arrives as a simple, calm knowing that you keep trying to argue away. Your body may know long before your mind is ready. The stomach tightens, the shoulders rise, the breath shortens, the sleep becomes shallow, the phone becomes an object of nervous worship. If a connection consistently makes you feel smaller, more confused, more dependent, that is not a sign to chase harder. It is a sign to listen more carefully. And listening carefully may reveal that what you called love was partly an old wound asking to be fed. That does not make the feeling fake, it makes it mixed. And mixed feelings need discernment, not fantasy. Love can be mixed with hunger at first. Many real relationships begin with projection, longing, and unconscious need. That alone does not make them doomed. But the relationship only becomes mature when both people begin to see each other more clearly and choose each other with open eyes. If the bond survives only because the fantasy is never challenged, then what you are holding may not be love at all. It may be the emotional architecture of an old lack. This is where maturity enters. Maturity does not mean you stop wanting. It means you stop worshiping wanting. It means you can feel the pull without obeying it blindly. It means you can say, yes, this touches something deep in me, and still ask, is this actually good for me? It means you no longer confuse intensity with truth. It means you can let a connection be meaningful without letting it become your identity. That is what individuation looks like in this area of life. Individuation is not becoming cold. It is not becoming detached in a fake, superior way. It is the gradual process of becoming more whole, more conscious, less ruled by unconscious need. It is the movement from being possessed by a pattern to being able to see it. And once you see it, you are no longer entirely inside it. That is the beginning of choice. Not the choice of forcing love, the choice of refusing to abandon yourself in its name. A woman can love deeply and still know the difference between a bond that nourishes her and a bond that feeds on her emptiness. She can feel longing and still choose not to turn longing into a life strategy. She can miss someone and still not make their absence the center of her identity. She can grieve a connection and still stop calling every ache love just because it is familiar. This is not about becoming hard. It is about becoming accurate. Accuracy is a form of self-respect. and self-respect changes the whole inner atmosphere. The phone no longer feels like an altar. The silence no longer feels like a verdict. The waiting no longer feels noble. It just feels like waiting. And sometimes, when the spell breaks, you realize how much of your suffering came not from the person, but from the meaning you kept assigning to their inconsistency. That meaning was the hook. That meaning was the hunger speaking. That meaning was the part of you that believed being chosen would finally make you whole. But wholeness does not arrive through being chosen by the wrong person in the wrong way. Wholeness grows when you stop making your emptiness someone else's responsibility. That is the real turning point. Not when they text, not when they explain, not when they finally understand, but when you stop confusing the relief of being fed with the dignity of being loved. Love is not a sugar rush. Love is not the panic of almost losing someone. Love is not the high of getting a little more than you expected. Love is something quieter and more difficult than that. It is the willingness to meet another person without losing your own soul in the process. And if you are not there yet, that is okay. You do not have to shame yourself for having been hungry. You only have to become honest about it. Because honesty is what ends the cycle, not punishment, not self-blame, not dramatic closure, honesty. The kind that says, this connection touched me because it touched my wound. The kind that says, I was not only loving, I was also longing. The kind that says, I need more than being intermittently chosen. The kind that says, I can feel this deeply and still not make it my home. That sentence can change a life. And when you are ready, you may notice something else. The more you return to yourself, the less desperate the world feels. You stop needing every interaction to mean your future. You stop reading every pause as a message from fate. You stop mistaking the activation of a complex for a sign that this person is uniquely yours. Sometimes the deepest love story is not the one you imagined. It is the one where you finally stop leaving yourself to keep someone else close. It is the moment you sit in the quiet room, look at the phone without panic, and realize your body is not begging anymore. It is listening differently. It is coming back to you. And maybe that is the real difference between love and emotional hunger. Love brings you closer to your center. Hunger makes you lose it. Love widens the room inside you. Hunger narrows it. Love can survive truth. Hunger survives only on fantasy. So when the old ache rises again, when the mind starts building stories from silence, when the heart wants to turn a person into a cure, pause and ask the question that changes the direction of your life. Am I loving this person, or am I using this person to avoid feeling what has been empty in me for too long? That question is not cruel, it is merciful. Because once you can answer it honestly, you can begin to love without starving. You can want without collapsing. You can miss without mistaking. You can remember without returning to self-abandonment. And if you ever find yourself at that silent phone again, in that same quiet room, with the same old ache rising in your chest, let the ache be a signal, not a command. Let it tell you where the wound lives. Let it point you back to the part of you that has been waiting to be met with steadiness, not drama. That is where your life begins to change. Not when someone finally fills the emptiness. When you stop calling emptiness love.